This is the Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Dan Morrison from the University of Alabama in Huntsville. My guest today is Dr. Jasmine Harris, incoming full professor and chair of Africana Studies at Metropolitan State University in Denver. Dr. Harris holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Minnesota and is author of Black Women, Ivory Tower, Revealing the Lies of White Supremacy in American Education, published in 2024 by Broadleaf Books. Merging sociological analysis with memoir, the book compellingly demonstrates the complex effects of white supremacy on Black women within our educational institutions. Today on the Annex, education as a racialized institution, white supremacy, and the consequences for Black women of getting into and remaining at historically white-serving colleges and universities. Stay with us. Dr. Jasmine Harris, welcome to the Annex. So good to have you with us.
Thank you. And I have to say that you saying my new title, it's the first time I've heard someone else say it. So it made me a little giddy. I'm very excited for Black women professors, especially reaching the full professor milestone is something that so many of us do not get to experience. So it is not lost on me to hear like full professor and my name together still makes me smile, certainly.
All of a full professor right here on the Annex. Dr. Harris. So your book is so rich, providing many touch points with scholarship in the sociology of education, Black studies, and beyond. And among these are connections to Du Bois, Goffman, and perhaps less overtly, CRT in education. I think of your book as something of a modern counterpart to the famous Du Bois essay in Souls of Black Folk, where he describes the veil and double consciousness. So you describe this as presence without belonging, and that process, importantly, is lifelong.
Yeah, The Souls of Black Folk was one of the first books, along with the presentation of self and everyday life, Irving Goffman's book that I talk about in my own book. And I actually, now that I'm thinking about it, those were probably from the same class in Intro to Sociology course. And reading those two things at the same time, at the same age, around like 18 or 19, as a Black girl who had always been one of the few in predominantly white settings, especially when we're talking about school. Reading Du Bois sort of work through this idea of simultaneously being both American, but also sort of quintessentially anti-American by virtue of being a Black man in a country that for so long held so fiercely, right, to enslavement as an important institution. And it was the first time that I had read the words of someone else who was Black talking about this sort of internal divide that you had to make in order to survive in the United States and, across a lot of different institutions. And the more experiences that I had as a student and then as a graduate student and a faculty member, and the more that I came to think about these theories and work with CRT and work with intersectionality and thinking about Black feminist thought, the double consciousness of it all as the foundation, right, became so much more clear. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book was that, no disrespect to Du Bois, right, but he's writing in the early 1900s. He's also a Black man. And I wanted something that Black women and girls could read and say, I see myself in that, right? I understand these experiences. And now I have, someone in a position of expertise telling me that those things aren't about me, that they are about the institution. And the most rewarding part of all of this in terms of the book and publishing it has been having these women, these younger girls who have read the book come and say, thank you, for talking about this stuff in such an explicit way. It's one of those things where we all know that it's happening, right? And we experience it, but we do so little talking about it. And I think that's what was so interesting about Du Bois when he's writing The Souls of Black Folk, right? Is that he's not saying anything that you couldn't see walking around, on any street in Harlem or wherever. in 1906, but people weren't talking about it in this way. They weren't giving voice to it as a way for other people to understand the book. So to hear you talk about it and think about it as relational to that means that I've done the job that I wanted to do.
Just you talking about the reaction you're getting makes me think about something we said offline before we started recording. In my experience talking to Black women faculty and having them talk about their experiences at a previous institution, that I was describing it in very similar terms that you use, in terms of always a guest or always a visitor, even people who were explicitly recruited, not necessarily because of their race and gender, but because they had a specific, highly valued expertise that the university wanted to go after. People who were pulled from industry, people who had full-on other careers, who did not need to go
Right.
and had a desire, of course, and obviously accepted the job, but did not have a strong need in terms of like not having other options or whatever to join a university, in this case one with a very specific mission and history. And yet when they got there and when they chose to remain there, it really didn't matter. It didn't matter how much they committed to the institution, didn't matter how many students they mentored, didn't matter how great they were in the classroom, didn't matter their role in terms of faculty governance or administrative positions or leadership in various ways. There was literally nothing that they could do that was even remotely in their control to move outside of visitor status or guest status. When you're in someone's home and you're the guest,
Right. Right.
And they're like, do I take my shoes off? Or like,
Right.
what are the core sort of like, don't go rifling through people's cabinets, stuff like that.
Right.
Whereas if you're in your own house, they're your cabinets. So you can do whatever.
Take your shoes off. Put your feet up on the table, right?
Exactly. To hear, these are people who had 30 plus year careers. To hear people say that and have to endure that is just, it reminds me of a line from Souls of Black Folks, something about dogged strength. Right? Or tenacious strength that is required in those situations.
Right. Today we really talk about it in terms of grit and perseverance, right? And the thing about what these women are describing and, what I have experienced similarly and write about in the book is that in other industries, there is not an expectation of belonging in the same way, right? When you go to, I worked in public relations out in San Francisco for a number of years before I started my PhD in sociology. And when you walk into a client's offices, right, it's very much, this is not home, right? Keep your shoes on, make sure you're on your P's and Q's in the bathroom, you're washing your hands for the appropriate amount of time, and you're not opening things you're not supposed to be, cabinets and doors and things you're not supposed to be opening. And there is this expectation, right, of distance between people in other industries. Higher education is an interesting one. And K through 12 education, this happens maybe on a less intense basis. But in higher education, there is a lot of cultural language about belonging and family and the sort of familial relationships that you're supposed to create there. First as students, right? Because at most, especially if we're talking about more prestigious institutions, they're not commuter schools, right? So you're not just learning there, but you're also living there, right? You're working there. If you are a work study student like I was, you're eating there, right? And so you do have to think about, can I take my shoes off? I'd really like to take my shoes off. I've been here all day and I'd like to be able to let my hair down and relax a little bit. And in a lot of ways, administrations try to build structurally institutions that lead to that, feeling of being at home and family, and then culturally try to create those things. But because higher education is so distinctly and firmly rooted in white supremacy, right? And by that, I mean, when we were first creating higher education in the United States, the number one rule was no Black people, right? And that was the sort of leading rule for the first 200 years, 250 years or so of higher education. And so they can let us in, right? They can let us be students. They can hire us. They can hire us away from other institutions, right? But to create an environment and a culture where everyone, regardless of race or gender, feels that sense of belonging takes a much more deliberate and explicit desire to transform these old policies and cultural touch points that are racist in their very nature, right? If not necessarily sort of racist by virtue of who is executing the policies, then you are going to have this sort of perpetual sense of non-belonging amongst Black people in those settings. And also, and I'm writing a piece on this right now, issues with retention. You're going to have a rotating set of Black faculty and staff in and out because not all of us, right, to go back to the line in the Du Bois book that you were talking about, have that dogged perseverance or desire to. There was a Black girl that I met maybe the first week or two at Vassar. By the end of the semester, she was gone. She transferred to Howard, and she was like, absolutely not. Like, I cannot do this. I saw her do that, thought about doing the same. And then, maybe in some ways, because I'm a little bit petty, sort of wanted to prove that I could hang here, right? That I wasn't going to let them run me out the door. But so many of us feel run out the door from the minute that we get there because there's no space to let your hair down. And if you have to be on all the time, right? Especially, for students, but also faculty who sometimes live there. My last institution, I was the faculty in residence. So I literally lived in an apartment that was in the basement of one of the dorms, which got really weird when all the students left for COVID. And then I was living on an abandoned college campus by myself for a year and a half. But that feeling is so familiar to so many of us because it is a feature of higher education. So it doesn't matter if you're at Columbia or Harvard or Vassar or Texas, that feeling is going to remain because the institutions were created to make people who look like us feel that way. And very little has been done in the last 50 to 100 years to try to address those issues in a way that would be truly transformative, right? Instead, you get a lot of superficial stuff. That doesn't work. You lose faculty. You try to bring in some more, and it becomes this cycle.
Well, in the intro to this episode, I mentioned historically white serving colleges and universities. And this is an important intervention you make. We typically talk about PWIs, primarily white institutions, HWIs, historically white institutions, but you call them historically white serving colleges and universities because you're naming the fact that these schools were organized to serve white people and whiteness more generally. So if you could give us an example, perhaps from your own experience, like drilling in on Vassar.
Yeah,
it's not too much to single out Vassar, which you do in the book, so it, feel like it's safe.
Right, yeah. And listen, my 20-year college reunion is coming up next year. We'll see how these conversations go after folks have read the book, but I'm okay talking about it. Vassar's an interesting institution. It's one of the Seven Sisters. So for those who don't know, higher education in the United States starts with the Ivies. We don't get land grant institutions until we get the first Morrill Act in the early 1800s, right? So first we're talking about Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and then, Columbia, Brown, those come a little bit later. All those schools, white men, white Protestant men, which is an important feature that I don't think gets talked about enough, especially with everything that's going on, with the student encampments on campus, the, pro-Palestinian protests, anti-Zionist protests that are going on campuses right now. I think a feature that has been missing in these conversations is that admissions policies that we are fighting over so much right now in terms of Black students, versus white students getting spots, in terms of legacy students versus students on athletic scholarship getting spots and, what's left. But admissions policies were created specifically to exclude Jewish students from Harvard and Princeton in particular. And there are letters back and forth from the presidents of Harvard and Princeton in the early 1900s, where they are complaining about this influx of Jewish students on campus and what can we do to minimize their representation amongst the student body. And that is where we get admissions policies. Admissions policies weren't created at first to keep Black people out. That wasn't necessary. Those were state-sanctioned rules, right? It didn't necessarily have to be that Harvard had to come out and say, we are not taking Black people, right? It was just sort of written into it. And so admissions policies have actually a far more insidious start to their inclusion in these things. So we're talking about Harvard, Princeton, Yale. We're talking about rich, white, Protestant men. Schools started to be formed, Vassar among them, for the female counterparts, right? Where do the wealthy white women who want to be educated and who want to marry educated, wealthy white men, where will we educate them, right? And this was still sort of a tumultuous idea. The rumor at Vassar was always that the reason that the hallways in main building, which was the original structure of the institution, are so wide because Matthew Vassar was going to turn the location into a brewery if the school thing didn't work out, if he couldn't get enough women in to pay the tuition. And in fact, our mascot is the Brewers, although that doesn't work in NCAA play because you can't have alcohol things. So then we become the Eagles, but we're actually the Brewers, right? For that purpose. So Vassar is built and opened in 1865, something like that. And it is specifically for wealthy white women. So it's right around emancipation, but you also still have a number of Black people, especially Black women, who are working in domestic jobs. And in fact, that's sort of the foundation of Black women as heads of households. It's because post-emancipation, Black women had an easier, quote unquote, time finding jobs in domestic labor compared to men who were being targeted by loitering laws and things like that to subsume them back into the prison system and essentially the slave system. Anyway, this is a long way around to say. When we got to Vassar, this has all since been renovated. But when I got there in 2001, none of the dorms had been renovated. Maybe ever might be too strong of a phrase, but that's what it seems like. In a long, long time, right? And in fact, my dorm closed after my freshman year so that it could be renovated because it was a big fire hazard. My freshman year, I lived in a one-room double in the middle of the hall. Next door, two guys lived in a two-room double. I admittedly didn't know much about dorms, only looked at a few schools when I was going through the application process in terms of visiting them in person. So I was really confused about the makeup of this room. So in this two-room double, there's one big room that you walk into from the hallway. And then there's a tiny little room off of that room. And I couldn't understand why two people who were paying the same amount in room and board, which was considerable, even back then, one person would get to live in this huge room, like huge, like the size of an oversized living room. And then the other person would live in what was essentially like a glorified closet, only wide enough across to put the twin bed, with wise across. And it wasn't until a few years later when I was doing some research in special collections for a different project that I came to find out that those were the maids or slave quarters, right? That these women would come first with enslaved folks and after emancipation with maids that they were paying, but that were there to be at their beck and call. And I thought, how weird for me as a Black person, right, to be sort of existing on this campus with these clear physical examples of what my role would have been. And no one is having any conversations about it, not in class. Even thinking about it now as a faculty member, I feel like I would have brought it up all the time. As I said, it's been renovated now, so they probably can't talk about it as much, but I'm sure that there are photos. We have photos, of ourselves in the rooms. But it wasn't something that was ever brought up. And then as a faculty member, my first job after I finished my PhD was a visiting position at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And Wake Forest famously used to be a working tobacco plantation, and it was donated to become Wake Forest from the owners of that plantation. On the quad, the quad is lined with these huge, beautiful magnolia trees. But those are also trees where people were actively hanged. And there was never a discussion about that. And I remember the first time walking through the quad on a day when the magnolias were blooming and the trees were just, in their full glory. And these are hundreds of year old trees, right? And it's like, I'm being asked again to exist on this campus, to think about being family here and letting my hair down in a place where there are these visible reminders of the violence of enslavement. And so when I talk about historically white serving institutions, I thought that it was so important to parse that out. Right? That yes, these places are also predominantly white in terms of the makeup of the people who are there now. But they are also historically white serving in that the role and the violence and the trauma of Blackness is evidenced everywhere. And that evidence also tells us that this is a place that was meant to serve a particular population, and everything from the trees to the room layouts, to the campus are about serving those populations historically. And that wouldn't have been me, right? And something that I often ask white students and faculty to think about when I'm talking about this stuff is, what do you think it feels like to be in a place that the people who created it wouldn't want you there? Right. And I think that that's sort of a more sort of profound question when you think about it in terms of the United States in general, right? That like the forefathers, were so fond of bringing out to tout what they would or wouldn't have wanted. Well, we know for certain what they didn't want is a bunch of free, educated Black people walking all over the place and attending the schools that they created to be essentially like mills to create people like them. And if that's all that higher education is in a lot of ways, that means that we as Black people, Black women in particular, have to not just contend with the people who are there now, right? And the structures that are there now, but we also have to contend with the history of the place and how that history sort of impacts the culture that it has now.
Yeah. Okay. There's so many places I could go. Certainly. No, it's so good. Also in that Du Bois essay, he starts off and basically he says, they're not asking the real question. The real question is, how's the a problem, right?
Yep.
And even the presence, of course, for Jefferson, the presence of Black women were on the UVA campus. He would have died. I mean, he would have had a heart attack and died,
right,
if they were anything other than a service role. I happen to know UVA quite well. The whole place is built around the comfort and support of the white male Protestant students who were there. And it is entirely supported by the work of enslaved folks who were hired out. And then, there were apparently some restrictions on students bringing their own enslaved folks with them. People who want to learn about this stuff, the University Studying Slavery group, of which I'm a part, is doing a lot of work in this area in the pre-Civil War era and also in the ages of segregation.
Virginia is such an interesting, I've only been on the campus once. I played rugby in college and we played against them for some reason. And I remember feeling, I must have been 20 at the time, and not having like a very deep historical background in the campus itself, but just feeling like, and I said this to my parents later, like it felt very eerie and sort of like stifling energetically to be there as a Black person. And I kept saying to my friends, that my other players on the team, like, oh, this campus feels weird. I don't like it here, and they were like, what are you talking about? It's beautiful. Look at all the trees. And I was like, oh, I don't, and so it's interesting to hear all of that historical a background because I immediately went back to that place and that sort of feeling that I had at the time of being on that campus. So I'm not surprised to hear that it has this very sort of deep history in terms of who it was serving and why the campus was built that way. Honestly, any institution, state, land grants included, that were built before like 1890 have this very clear sort of white serving physical history. And if you go back and look at blueprints of the campus, if you look at policies, the best thing about special collections is all of the handwritten and hand typed notes between administrators, that sort of reveal true feelings about things, that you wouldn't already get. But for anyone, to your point, who is interested in this topic, that information is there. It's just that schools, and again, we sort of had this come up at Columbia with the encampments and stuff. It's like schools simultaneously want to sort of allude to these great, student activist leaders in their history while also actively ignoring, a lot of the negative repercussions of that, the way administrators think. I talk about Anita Hemmings in my book, is the first woman to graduate from Vassar while she was passing as a white woman. That story was never told to me when I was a student there, which is crazy, to think about. Something that I came up in the special collections that I found was this book, and it's called Being Black at Vassar. And it was printed in 1977, and it is made by Black Vassar students at the time. That's sort of here's how you survive this institution. It was never printed again. It was, the one copy that they had is in special collections. And, I was able to take pictures of it. But the first thing I thought was, why is this the first time that I'm seeing this in 2018 when I was a student there, and that information would have made me feel more like family. Vassar just had their graduation this past weekend, and the messaging on social media was very much like, we survived a tumultuous and tense year, much like many other institutions ending the year with encampments and whatnot. But we came out the other side and we just reminded ourselves that we're all family, right? And I'm looking at the pictures and it's like the sea of white people. And it's like, sure, I'm sure those people feel like family. But what about the Palestinian students on campus? What about the Black students on campus? What about all of those students for whom there is no family here, even if that's what we're looking for? And in a school like Vassar, which is small and secluded, everyone's looking for that. The faculty, are looking for that. When I was there, and I'm sure this is probably still true, faculty had students at their homes all the time, mostly because most of the faculty live within walking distance of the institution, because Poughkeepsie is such a small place. And when you have difficulty, as I did, trying to make that family coat fit, over me in a way that it just couldn't, the more you feel like you are failing, at something. And when I was starting in 2001, again, I didn't know this at the time, but it was the largest class of legacy students that they'd ever had. Something like 35% of the class of 2005 were legacy students in some way, right? And so that adds to it. So it's not just the school saying we're a family, then there's also this huge contingent of students that actually feel at home already. They're not asking anybody if they can take off their shoes, because they know where the shoe cubby is in the back, that like this sort of familiarity that can't be taught. And when it is ignored, right, the sort of privilege that gives to certain students compared to others, that's when you start to see minoritized students, minoritized faculty give up. When you were talking earlier about the Black women that and the experiences that they have had, and how they talked about how there's nothing they can do, right? So much has to happen before a person gets to, there's nothing I can do, right? That's not the first response. That's the 50th response after you've tried this and that. You've, tried to chair like I have. I was the president of the Black Faculty and Staff Association this year at UTSA. I was the program coordinator for African American Studies. I turned it from a minor into a major and wrote all of the curriculum and everything. And it was like, maybe, I can do all of these things and ingratiate myself in the community and the culture in such a way that I will finally feel like family, and other people will recognize me as, a family member in this institution. But that's so unlikely to come to pass. Maybe there's 1% of us that can say that they have found that space in a historically white serving institution. That then we say there's nothing, right? That we get to a point where we're not even interested in trying anything else because we've sort of resigned ourselves to being these perpetual outsiders in higher education. And that means that we are missing out on a lot economically, socially, professionally. And it also means that the institutions are able to maintain their whiteness, right? And continue to prioritize serving the white members of their community in a way that looks and feels very akin, to how these institutions started.
Yeah, while extracting just superhuman levels of labor, right? I mean, it's work, it's labor.
Right.
Okay, I want to pick up one thread from the book and just highlight for people that this is not just a story of the sociology of higher education or your experience at the university level. In the section on school integration, you discuss the fact that many Black people in the South wanted schools that were of high educational quality. They did not necessarily want integration, especially if integration, racial integration, meant that schools would be dominated by white political leaders. And let's face it, when Brown versus Board of Education happened, which certainly was a monumental decision and was a result of a great deal of political and legal work, not least from people who are well-known. Thurgood Marshall, for example.
Right.
Derek Bell, lots of people like that. But many of those Black parents and Black folks at the time felt that even if their schools received tattered books and meager funding, they were at least led by Black professionals and partially supported by Northern philanthropy. Can you say more about the benefits of schools led by Black people for Black students?
Yeah, Brown versus Board of Education is a complicated ruling, and we're just celebrated its 70th anniversary. So been sort of talking and thinking about this a lot recently. School integration was one of those things where for Black folks and Black communities, especially in the South, it was about the principle of the thing, right? More than actually this desire for their Black students to be in classrooms with white students, right? It was one, the idea that they could legally be kept out of those spaces, right? And two, that legality meant that what we were seeing was this very disparate and unbalanced spread of revenue and funding for schools, right? So it wasn't that the many, many parents and children who were involved in individual sort of local lawsuits that lead us to Brown versus Board of Education. It wasn't that those parents wanted their kids in white schools. It was that they wanted their kids to have access to the things that white kids also had access to in their schools. And the reason that it was more about access to resources as opposed to about being in classes with white students, because one of the unintended consequences of universities and colleges not hiring Black teachers with master's degrees or even doctorates was that many of them then came back to their local communities and taught at the high schools. So, Paul Laurence Dunbar High School in DC is a famous example of this, where you had literally doctoral students and folks with PhDs teaching high school, right? And so these Black students were getting, in a lot of ways, a better education than their white counterparts for whom they weren't being taught by PhDs, because all the PhDs were teaching at the universities and, at the prestigious colleges. And so it wasn't the teaching, it was the materials that they had access to and the spaces that they were being asked to teach in. That was the sort of driving force for integration. My great aunt and her husband were sort of deeply involved in this. They both had master's degrees from the Teachers College at Columbia University. That's where they met. And then they moved back to Malvern, Arkansas, which is where my mother's family is from, and ran the local colored high school, essentially. And then when integration happened, and this is true across the country, the Black school closed and all of those teachers were displaced, save for a few. In the case of Malvern High School, Malvern's colored high school, my great aunt Henrietta and her husband were given lesser roles at the integrated school. And in part, one of the reasons that they were able to even stay employed was because they had master's degrees. And you couldn't make a strong argument that there were white teachers who should be replacing them. But we lost something like 40,000 Black teachers across schools in the United States post Brown versus Board of Education. And that wasn't the intent of the families who were participating in these lawsuits. And what happened, which is what so often happens when, white politicians get involved in these things, is that once that ruling was passed, it became, okay, how can we make this as punishing and as extractive for Black communities? Almost as to say, maybe you won't ask for so much next time, if you see what is going to be required. And so it's a shame that we don't talk about this more. We want to sort of think about integration and school integration as a turning point in the civil rights movement. And that is propaganda, right? That, is used to encourage Black people to feel content with, where we are. Well, we at least got integration. We used to have to go to the colored school. And it's like, well, at the colored school, they're being taught by Mary Church Terrell. And, these highly educated writers, thinkers, scholars, sociologists, and cultural anthropologists. And after they didn't have access to those people and were also now being forced to face violence and trauma and exclusion, the Little Rock Nine that integrated Central High School in Little Rock, they talked about not just the screams and the spitting and the signs and the protesting as they were walking into the classroom. We have visible evidence of that, right? But what prevented so many of those 9 students from ever graduating from high school was what they experienced inside, right? They talk about being beat up in the bathrooms, being ignored by the teachers in the classrooms when they were trying to participate. They talk about having food thrown at them in the lunchrooms, right? And so those students wanted, in terms of civil rights, to participate in this integration. But as a part of that, they ended up not getting the education that they were seeking. The governor of Arkansas famously canceled school for the entire state after the first year of integration, in particular because of the things that were going on at Little Rock Central. And so now nobody can learn, right? If bringing 9 Black students into a 2,000 student high school is going to lead to this much trauma and violence, again, that's just evidence that these are places where they do not want to see us. And you can have a Supreme Court ruling, and much love and respect to the work that Thurgood Marshall did to bring that case to its conclusion, and the ruling for integration. But in the execution, of school integration in the United States, Black people lost a lot more than they gained.
Yeah, I think it's a very hard lesson for people who do, as you say, want to see Brown versus Board as some kind of beginning of the end of America's addiction to white supremacy and racism in education, but then beyond, of course, because it stands in not just for integration of schools, but also for a pretty seemingly dramatic change in the racial organization of society. And of course, it has not worked out that way. And we know that schools today are just as racially segregated, if not more in many cases, than they were in the immediate aftermath of the implementation of Brown versus Board, which is different than the decision.
Right.
In any case, we could have that's a whole other very lengthy conversation.
Yeah.
Several sections of your book turn to your personal experiences in these institutions of education, but also with well-meaning, socially liberal white people. So how have you dealt with the desire of white liberal audiences to have you describe in detail things like painful racist or sexist or racist and sexist experiences you've had while on campus, both while in undergrad, perhaps in graduate school, or now as a professor?
Yeah, that was the scariest part about writing all of this, right? Is that I know a lot of well-meaning white people, folks who would consider themselves allies, advocates, and, even in some extreme cases, activists on issues of racial inequality and racism in the United States. But something that I think we have to keep repeating for everyone is that we, Black people, right, we did not create these problems. We are simply trying to persevere, right, to the point that we were making earlier, to try to figure out ways to maneuver through these institutions in a way that gives us a modicum of financial stability and professional success. But we cannot change these things. Right. When I wrote this book, the idea was not that, here is a manual for change. And when we were shopping it, some of the publishers that we talked to were very much like, okay, I mean, they all said we needed an 8th chapter because it was only 7 chapters when we were first pitching it. A lot of publishers wanted that 8th chapter to be like a how-to. And I kept saying, I don't know. Right? Like, I'm not an administrator, right? 2, I am a Black person who was just trying to make observations and, connections to history, to sociology, to explain those observations. But I can't be tasked with fixing this institution. The people who have power and privilege, those are the ones who have to fix and change the institution. And so I did get calls, texts, emails from white people in my life, friends, coworkers who were, often apologetic, right, about my own experiences that they perhaps didn't know about because I didn't talk to them about those sort of very personal things. And 2, they were looking for reassurance that I wasn't talking about them. Right. And so, something that I've continued to say privately, but also when I do these kinds of interviews is that we have to get away from a discussion of race and racism as being about individuals. We're never going to be able to shift away from the kinds of most harmful racisms in the United States if we think about racism as coming from an individual, and if we just pluck that individual out of society, then the racism that they bore will go with them, right? Are individuals racist? Sure. Have I experienced overt racism from an individual that was based on their own thinking? Absolutely. But institutional racism in education goes beyond individuals, right? And so what I often tell people is, I think you're doing great, right? But that doesn't mean that you're not perpetuating the racism of the policies or the institutions or the industries or the professions where you find yourself. And if you are really committed to participating in some kind of change, then you, one, have to be willing to see that racism is everywhere and in everything and not just in people. It always makes me think about the Matrix, right? When like Neo can finally actually like see the visible matrix and it's just a bunch of ones and zeros, but he can like see through them. That's where white people have to get with racism, right? Where you can just see it in ways that have been previously invisible to you, because that's the most efficient and effective way for racism to work in the United States, if it's invisible to everyone. And once you start to see it, and that's a perhaps an occupational hazard of being a sociologist,
Yes.
who's interested in race. And it's something that started to happen to me from my first sociology class. I was like, whoa, hold on. Now we're talking about racism in systems and like, what does that mean? And eventually it becomes this thing where you can just see it everywhere. And for the white people that I call my friends, that I call my colleagues, if you're listening to this, I challenge you to think about racism beyond what you do or what your spouse does or what your children do or what your parents do. If you see racism in them, certainly call it out, right? Racist ideas, racist ideologies. But it's more important to start to be able to see and understand how racism works institutionally in order to make change. There's this woman sociologist, I don't know her personally, but I know her work. Her name is Jessie Daniels, and she just wrote this book, Nice White Ladies. And like, that's the kind of stuff I want to see from white people who are interested in allyship, right? Where you are talking to an audience of your peers and saying, listen, this is how we are contributing to the institution of racism, right? If you want to think about racism and races as institutional things in the United States. And here is what we have to do with each other to call those things out. I think so often we ask the Black people to figure out how to fix it. And it's like, one, and this is something I always start my Black studies courses with. Black people are less than 13% of the population, right? In that way, we are almost unicorn-like in our presence, right? But because there's been so much extraction of Black culture and Black coolness into American society, it makes people feel like, and there's a lot of data on this, that we're actually 40 or 50% of the population. And so when you think about, no, we're not that, you're actually asking, 12% of the population to fix something that is pervasive amongst 100% of the population, that can't happen. So be sad maybe about the things that you've read that have happened to me in particular, but think about the bigger picture of this, which is, why did those things happen to me in the places that they happened to me? And how might you call those things out the next time you see them?
Yeah, it's been my experience talking about white supremacy in education and colleges and universities especially, that many well-meaning liberal white people would like to be exonerated from any mistakes they might have made or any thoughts they have or opinions they have that are actually completely predictable if you understand the society as being structured by white supremacy, as I think we could say that it is, given the evidence. And yet what they would like to have is a but not you kind of dispensation from the nearest Black person.
Exactly. Yeah.
And with that exoneration, it's not only the interpersonal part, but I think you're importantly pointing to the structural and institutional part. So white folks don't want to just be exonerated from having to think about their own maybe actions and complicity on an interpersonal level with racism and white supremacy, but they also want to be exonerated from the intensive institutional and social structural organizational work that has to happen. Right. And so I was just listening to another podcast this morning about the folks who came out in the summer of 2020. We had this, George Floyd obviously was murdered, and there were other murders of Black Americans, both men and women, in the spring of that year. It's highly likely that among the millions of Americans who demonstrated and came out, in a very challenging time, that the majority of those folks were white. It's hard to count exactly, but
Mm-hmm.
for the sake of argument, let's say the majority were white. And so those folks went and bought a yard
Mm-hmm.
sign and put it in their yard and then
Mm-hmm.
opened the door to their house, closed the door, and went to their living room. And then that was it.
Yeah.
The very fact that they had a suburban house to go into,
Exactly.
and the very fact that that suburban house
Yeah.
most likely at some point in time in history had a racially restrictive covenant on it,
Mm-hmm.
and that we have not redressed the fundamental racism of those policies and their effects, which are actually violations of the
Mm-hmm.
14th Amendment of this Constitution, does not cross their mind, right?
Right.
We also talk about the mortgage interest deduction and property taxes, but
Yes.
the way that those systems are the default, and the default itself is racially biased in its
Right.
sometimes explicitly in its intent, but even in none of its in its explicit intent, in its effects, is a big problem that also folks want to like opt out of.
Yeah. Yeah. There's been a lot, really since the 2016 election, right? It's been a lot of this sort of simultaneous, it's like doublespeak, right? This is simultaneous, I want to be a part of the change, right? While also, sitting in their living rooms on their, phones that use cobalt and, all of this, all of this, distancing themselves individually from the thing that's happening. And it makes me think about how we have gotten to this place where post George Floyd, all of these institutions are talking about equity, and we're really looking into the unlawful killing of civilians by police and the rates of that, and the racialization of the victims, and all of that is a reflection of a distaste for having a Black president for 8 years, right? And we are now sort of seeing the response to that, right? And George Floyd, it was felt very similar, especially, I'm from Minneapolis originally, and immediately post George Floyd, I again living on a abandoned college campus at that at that point, and I remember going for a walk, which is like the only thing that I could do for fun really at that time, and seeing pro George Floyd stuff graffitied across the dining hall of this campus, right? And thinking, wow, we are really sort of moving into a place of acknowledging institutional racism that I wasn't expecting us to get to so quickly. And I, interviewed for this job at UTSA, and they were very much like, the president put out a statement about diversity and equity and inclusion, just like all the other presidents did at that time. And when I was interviewing, it was like, this minor program has been sort of fledgling for a decade, and now we're ready to make it a major. And we're going to bring you in, and you're going to have tenure track lines to hire folks, and you're going to have a budget, and we're going to be so supportive. And then within 18 months, all of that language was gone, and any sort of discussion about equity and inclusion now was sort of wrapped up into conservative talking points about, again, the sort of historically white serving institutions being asked, why are there all these Black people here all of a sudden, right? And that, like, so many question again sort of goes to this overestimation of our presence simply by virtue of seeing one or two, because this is not where you belong. This is not where we expect you to be. And so, it's almost been, dizzying in terms of how quickly everyone was willing to move away from those discussions of institutionalized racism in the United States more broadly. And I think it is indicative of what happens when we ask Americans to start, thinking really closely about race. People resent that. They resent not being able to just call a person a racist and move on to the next thing. Once we start talking about schools as racist and industries as racist, now we're calling into question everything, because I like those schools and I went to that schools and I liked that television show. And, why are we asking why there weren't any Black people in Friends? Because who needs Black people there? Right? It just becomes, now we're encroaching on your understanding, right? And that's what made me think about Obama, because as he's running and after he wins, it's like, yes, everyone's excited, Black president. Did you know Black people used to, they helped build the original White House, and look at where we've gotten, right? And then immediately it was like, actually, what I'm looking for is like, make America great again. It wasn't great before because we had that Black guy in the White House. And I resented having to think about race and talk about race and hear a Black man talk to me about race, during the State of the Union address and all of that. And so, it's been, I would argue, the last 3 or 4 years for Black people in general, but, especially in higher education, has been really tough, because we're trying to maneuver an institution that simultaneously wants to be seen doing good, as it revolves around equity and inclusion, while not making many changes.
Well, I think that's a good segue to my next question. So on page 81, you write, there are a few social or psychological protections for a Black student at a white college, and those that exist are OACs. It seems to me that recent bans on DEI programs and spaces supercharge what some scholars have called diversity dilution when universities seek to replace, for example, a Black culture center with generic student success programs and spaces. And I would expect that any remaining Black students on these historically white-serving campuses would try as much as they have been and continue to try to make a way out of no way, but that the most marginalized will have even more difficult time on campus. And I just saw recently an ad from a major state flagship public institution advertising for the director of a student success center. And explicitly in the ad, they say something like, this director will occupy a position formerly known as insert name of minority student group, and now will serve all students under the new name Student Success Center. What do you think, Dr. Harris?
That school sounds like it's in Texas.
It is not in Texas.
Okay.
But it might as well be. I mean,
right.
But not just, obviously, the whole point here is that these things are not limited to Texas. They're not limited to Florida. They're not limited to other states, including ones whose names start with the letter A.
Yeah, no, I said it sounds like Texas because obviously I'm in Texas and we're dealing with that right now. I said that this last couple of years have been hard. I've, seen people that I know, that I work with, be laid off, from Texas schools in positions at student centers. And this, again, the sort of propaganda that equity and inclusion isn't about everybody, right? That it's just about minoritized students and they're getting all of the attention, and that's taking away from the attention that white students are getting, and they're, being left by the wayside. That's not actually what's happening at all, right? These offices are generally one of one on campuses, and they are the one place that is actively interested in supporting these minoritized students, when the rest of the institution is sort of deeply, again, focused on serving white students, as is their history. It's so disheartening, this idea that, and we see this right now as students are getting acceptances and rejections from colleges, this conversation about, well, a mediocre Black student took the spot of this white student who was so much better than they were, right? And how dare they? That's not how this system is supposed to work. when, again, to the sort of point of being able to see where the racism exists in the institutions themselves, there's no way that one of the 55 Black students that are going to get into Harvard outside of athletic scholarships this year took a spot from a white student, because all the other students are going to be white, right? Those other white students took your spot, not these Black students. And so this idea that these offices and that these policies are overly focused on minoritized students and are overly supporting minoritized students misunderstands these institutions as places not deeply and heavily focused on white students, white male students all the time. Even, this has been a growing question, and very similar to this discussion about Black students taking white student spots, or Black faculty taking white faculty spots. That was a big conversation on Twitter a few weeks ago. That it's very similar to conversations that I've seen, some articles that I've seen written recently about boys in K through 12, right? It's, well, we've got all this programming for girls and now the boys are being left behind. And it's like, so you're telling me 15 years of focusing on girl students has totally shifted the institution of K through 12 education such that boys are now suddenly having all of these sort of negative implications. That's not how misogyny and patriarchy, as institutions in education work, right? Ensuring that girls don't feel like they can't do math and science doesn't mean that you're ignoring the boys, right? And this idea that there cannot be room for everyone is one that is rooted in hierarchy, right? I want these people to be focused on first and then these people to come last. But any argument that the Office of Student Success, in all of its power is shifting that hierarchy is just misinformed. And what happens and what has been happening and what we dealt with at UTSA this year is the students lose out. Our Multicultural Center of Equity and Justice was renamed to simply the Multicultural Center with a focus on all students. Our Office of Inclusive Excellence was closed and all of the employees displaced. But those two offices work together every year to put on the Ujima celebration, which is the Black graduation, and the Lavender celebration, which is the LGBTQIA celebration. But because SB 17 passed, they could no longer, as offices, lead the charge in holding those events. And so it became the responsibility of the student orgs to essentially put on their own celebration. And I, as the Black faculty and staff president, did as much as I could to try to help them fundraise and organize and set up so that they didn't feel like they were doing it on its own. But one, I'm leaving, right? And two, SB 17 is not going anywhere. And in fact, the politicians here have threatened even more severe kinds of legislation coming down the pike in the next few years. And so it was just so heartbreaking to see these students. And this is the class of 2024. So they also are the class of 2020 from high school. They didn't have prom. They didn't have graduation. And now there was a moment, in late April when I was like, I don't know if we're going to be able to do this, guys. Like, I want to be able to help you with this, but I just don't see a path forward in terms of funding and space and all of that. And I'm so glad that we were able to put it on, but it ends up being the students who lose out. And then we are simply perpetuating the same disadvantages amongst minority students that we have always had. And perhaps that's the point.
So much of what you just said resonates with what a former guest on the Annex, Antara Tichafakunda at UC Santa Barbara, documents in his book, Black Campus Life, especially the part about students themselves taking on a lot of the labor of holding events, being a visible presence for, in his case, Black engineering students, really the additional and often invisible labor that those students undertake. Listeners, if you haven't heard the Antar Teach of Akunda episode, go back and listen to that. It's on the feed, Spotify, and other places.
Great book, too.
Yes, I learned a lot. So, wanted to ask a question that I think is really an important insight and helped me a lot in your book. So, education scholars and sociologists, among others, discuss the many institutional barriers that Black women and other people of color face in our schools. And we also know something about what has been called microaggressions on campus and other ways that racism reveals itself in subtle and not so subtle ways interpersonally, and then, of course, institutionally. But in addition to this, you point out the double-sided nature of being a Black woman in the academy. There's both the high price of access in terms of breaking through barriers and the fact that interactions within the university require you to betray the dignity of other Black people by not speaking out when whites do racist things, which definitely happens. So your continued presence in the space is constantly at stake. Do I have that right?
Yeah. Yeah. And, we started this conversation by talking about how excited I am to be a full professor. And, one of the adages in academia, right, is that you just keep your head down and you wait till you get tenure, and then you can start talking about these things. And there's a lot of privilege and identity stuff that's sort of wrapped up in that. But, something that was really hard for me early on in my professional career was learning to deal with those microaggressions. And maybe that's not even the right term because the micro nature of them shifts depending on, what aggression we're talking about and who we're talking about participating in it. But, how to deal with those things while also trying to keep your job, essentially. I had a student who was unhappy with a grade that she got that I felt was representative of the work that she had done. And one thing about being a Black woman faculty, you have to keep meticulous books. You have to keep, all your emails archived because you have to have evidence of, what has transpired, because folks just will not believe you, giving you the benefit of the doubt. And so I had this student, she was unhappy with her grade. She was graduating and we talked about it. The dean talked about it. I turned over everything that I had and was unwilling to change the grade simply because she wanted it to be changed, which seemed to be the underlying issue. And she reported me to the Department of Education, the United States. And I spent that entire summer working with the institution's legal counsel to, essentially refute the claim and go through the process. Wow. And it worked out and, they believed me and I had, had all of the paperwork to back myself up. But I bring up that story because this is a student who was notoriously racist. I mean, she would say things in class, where I'd have to stop her and unravel the things that she was saying. She would say things to me in office hours over email that, implied that she had very little respect for me, for my position, and that she felt it was fine to challenge me in any of those respects. And honestly, I was so pissed off, mostly because it was like, you earned this grade. It wasn't a failing grade. I always got the sense that she had very domineering parents. And instead of explaining why she got this, it was a C, right? So it's not
a C,
even a bad grade. Like instead of just explaining why she got the C.
We're talking about a C.
Right.
Okay.
Right. This is over a C. Yes. This is over a C. Right. And so instead of coming clean and saying, I didn't turn some things in, I didn't show up that often, like this is what it is, she was able to convince her parents that it was some reflection on this big, mean Black woman professor that's been bothering me all semester. I tell the story in my book about bringing in a woman faculty member from Vassar actually to do an event very early in my career. I think this was like my second year, and having something racist happen on campus with a white faculty member, and then on the one hand having to apologize to this woman that I brought to campus, and then simultaneously feeling like I can't call out the woman who was actually being racist because she's an associate professor and I just got here and I'm Black and she's white, and it's going to be this whole thing on this little campus. And we do so much of that. We do so much stifling to get through. I think because I'm a sociologist, because I do Black studies, I have learned over time to turn a lot of those situations into like teaching moments for people. So it feels like this isn't me being mad, right? This is me educating you as like expert in the space, but we can't. There are things that a white woman would just not tolerate, in academia, would go to the respective authorities, to report it immediately, that we are expected to just take and to just tolerate, because when we then try to report things, now we become the problem. We're the tattletale. We're making things difficult and uncomfortable for folks. And that's hard, one, emotionally and psychologically, but also physically. I talk about this in the book, and it's one of the things that a lot of Black women who have read it, who are in academia, have come to me and said, me too. It's like, I had a lot of health issues that started as a college student, right, and that remained, through being a graduate student, intensified as a faculty member, that I think are a direct reflection of what happens when you're asked to swallow that kind of racism all the time. There's a reason that so many of us are gone before we hit 70, and so many of us have deep and lasting medical issues, that can be connected to the racism that we experience on a daily basis. And I think that there's a minimalization of that I'm trying to undo, that I want to be clear, like I had migraines and stomach issues and like all of this stuff that is a direct reflection of having to go into this place every day, to the analogy that we started this with, right? And be on my P's and Q's and like constantly feel like, can't take my shoes off. I can't let my hair down. I can't take my mask off. I'm sucking my stomach in. I'm like not breathing, the way that I'm supposed to be breathing. And what does that do to a person's like physical constitution year after year, day after day, month after month? I'm 12 years in this profession now, and I can see the wear on myself and on people like me.
Many directions we could go from here. I think I want to ask just a couple more things. It's rare for Black students to have Black teachers, K-12 or in college. And on pages 114 and shortly thereafter, you discuss not being taught Black sociologists in graduate school. How did you feel when you discovered them?
Annoyed. I think there's so much of, I think we all have complaints about our graduate training or lack thereof, right?
Never.
For me, I came into my graduate career not necessarily wanting to be a professor. I said that I'd worked in public relations. I came to understand that I was just not a 9-to-5 cubicle business person. Like I just couldn't picture myself doing that. I wanted to go back and do my PhD in sociology because it was the last time that I can remember feeling learning was fun and that I was being introduced to all of these things. And then I got there and I realized that, there's a very sort of narrow interpretation of what we should be doing, what we should be learning, how we should be implementing that learning to become the best job market candidates, right? Again, with this assumption that we're all being trained to be professors, even though many of us, don't end up in that track. And initially, I was encouraged to do technology stuff because I'd been working in clean technology, public relations. And so I did that for like the first year and I just really wasn't interested in it. And I knew that I sort of wanted to do something around race, but there weren't any courses on race. There's one Black faculty member when I was there, and she did end up being on my dissertation committee, but not until after she was tenured, right? So when I got there, she was still an assistant professor. And so I didn't even really get to interact with her much for the first couple of years. And then when it sort of became clear to me that I wanted to study race, there was a very concerted effort amongst the faculty in my program to steer me away from that, right? One, to their point, there aren't any classes for me to take, right? There weren't any faculty really to serve as mentors in that way. And basically the messaging was like, you're sort of on your own, if this is the way you want to take it. My graduate advisor was great in getting me through my dissertation in a timely fashion, but she wasn't an expert in Black feminist thought or anything like that. And so in a lot of ways, I was teaching her as we were going through this process. And so that really meant that the first couple of years of my professional career on the tenure track, I was still trying to figure out what I was doing. I was still, trying to understand Crenshaw and Bell and Hooks, who I really did not get any exposure during my grad school career. And I would say I'm still someone who feels way behind on Hooks. I feel like there are like 3 or 4 books still that I haven't read that I definitely need to. And hope to get to them soon. But, the further I get away from my graduate training, the more I recognize all the holes and how much who I am today professionally and the things that I have done are really a testament to my, again, sort of perseverance and desire to want to study this stuff and go in search of it. It wasn't being offered to me. And that's why I thought, when conservatives first started talking about the CRT stuff, it was like, we're not even getting Derek Bell in the PhD program. Like, what are we talking about here? Like the 10% of faculty in doctorate programs across the country that have one Derek Bell reading on their syllabus, like this isn't something that we are all being exposed to. I think it's a bit ironic now to see where we are, 12 years later, where, I'm sure many of the professors in my program would be more supportive of, being a race scholar today and then I used to not even be able to say that. I would have to say I'm a race, class, and gender specialist, right? I wouldn't even just say like I'm a race scholar because that would disqualify me from a lot of jobs and positions. And so, again, this is why I wanted to write this book, because if when I was a doctoral student, I had access to this, I would have felt more inclined to say, you know what, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. I'm going to do this thing over here and not let y'all make me feel like that's not worthy or that I won't be able to get a job or that, I was the first person in my cohort to finish my dissertation, even as I was actively being discouraged away from my topic of choice. And like, on the one hand, it's like, oh, I say that as a matter of pride. But on the other hand, it's like, but it's because I was doing it alone and I didn't have any friends and I didn't get invited to the like graduate student things. And so I was just working, all the time in our joint cohort office. So a lot of times I'd be the only one in there because they all went to like a picnic on the river or whatever that afternoon and nobody invited me and I didn't think to invite myself. So I just stayed and did work. But it was very lonely, and I would imagine that there are lots of folks who feel similarly about that journey to being a quote unquote race scholar in sociology.
Well, race scholars, send me a DM on X Twitter and you can have a spot on the Annex if we can work it out. So I want to end by talking about some lines toward the end of your book that really hit home for me. So on page 180, you write, "The systematic and psychological violence of white supremacy perpetuates internalized blame for Black people for depressed academic achievement." That's the first one. And on the next page, "Advanced learning reveals the lies of white supremacy in American education," which I think is like a home run line if there ever was one for the book. So I think many of the insights you share will actually be new to non-Black folks who don't think about this stuff a lot and really haven't had the privilege of the kinds of learning and relationships and, really unlearning that many folks should have. What do you hope stays with readers as they engage your book?
I hope what stays with them is that just because this isn't indicative of their own experience, that it means it's not happening. So much gaslighting happens to Black people about our experiences by white people who just refuse to believe that things could be this bad, right? It can't possibly be this way. Black people continue to say, yes, it is. Here's another, example of how bad it can get. And I think the message that I wanted for everyone, you asked earlier about white people, in my orbit who perhaps want to be allies. And I hope that what they take away from it is you didn't know that this was going on because Black people put so much labor into hiding the sort of day-to-day, minute-to-minute impacts of racism on our lives that it becomes unbelievable to you. But once you start to take what we're saying and the experiences that we're having at face value and you aggregate them, right? That's something that I really wanted to do in this book, is like take my own experiences and like aggregate them up against a bunch of other Black people who I know, who I don't know, who have had, similar experiences, to say, this isn't just me complaining. I think so much of my college and even my doctoral experiences, now that I think back on them, were about me internalizing the things that were happening to me as representative of some kind of failures or lacking that I didn't have. And in doing that, I was causing some of my own trauma, right? By sort of taking on that responsibility. But we come to take on that responsibility because we know that it's easier to say, this is on me, it's something I have to fix, than it is to say, this is an institutional problem that I cannot change if the institution doesn't want to change it. That's way heavier, right? That requires a bunch of people to buy in and years of, transitional work to change the culture. And because we don't do that, because we suck it up and say, I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to be the first to out petty them. I'm not going to transfer because I don't want them to feel like they've driven me out of this place. That makes it easier for you to say, this can't possibly be happening. And so providing spaces for Black people or going in search of conversations where Black people are being honest about these things only requires you to listen and to believe. That's the first step. And once you do that, then the idea of dismantling white supremacy in higher education becomes less daunting because you see the reasons why it needs to go. But when we're not talking about it, when you're not going in search of those conversations, then if one person says something, it feels like this anecdote that doesn't have a lot of weight or heft to it. And so I hope that folks who are new to this discussion walk away from this book thinking that there's so much more work that needs to be done that I didn't even realize. And they start to think about where they fit in doing that work. Everyone's not an activist, right? There's this conversation going on with all the encampments, right? It's like everybody's role isn't to get arrested, right? Some people have to be the organizers. Some people have to be the spokespeople. And so what is your role? That's something that when I give talks on like inclusion, inclusive leadership and stuff, I always leave folks with that at the end. Like, what do you want your role to be? How can you fit into this to try to affect change? That's the only way through. Otherwise, you might as well, put the blinders back on and head in the other direction.
That's so good, and a nice place to wrap this part of our discussion. I want to turn quickly to our banter segment. And as listeners know, I love food and I love travel. And as an academic, when I travel, it's almost always to conferences. It's never just to a lovely beach where I can sit. And although if anyone
Right.
out there, you want to sponsor a trip for me and any of my loved ones to a tropical place with white sandy beaches or just sandy beaches.
Pink.
Yeah, pink. Really, almost any color of beach would be fine. Have you had any recent conference travel and food experiences? So if you've been somewhere cool, tell us the conference and tell us the food. Give us a recommendation.
So in April, that was the most recent conference that I've been to. I was at the American Educational Research Association annual meeting, ERA, and it was in Philadelphia this year, which is always fun. I worked at an institution outside of Philadelphia for 7 years, so I am pretty well versed in the food, and I wanted to try something new. So I didn't get a cheesesteak. I'm not a cheesesteak person. I know a lot of folks at ERA were talking about Geno's versus Pat's.
Yeah.
Let me just give you a tip. Cheesesteak folks, don't go to either one of those.
Yeah.
Those are not the best places. My husband loves D'Alessandro's, which is on the north side, sort of getting into the Mount Airy, so Germantown area, which is also, to me, a nicer side of Philadelphia than the south side, which is where Pat's and Geno's are. So if you're looking for a cheesesteak and you're in Philadelphia, go to D'Alessandro's. It's on Henry Avenue. It's very delicious. Anyway, when I was there, I wanted to try something that I'd always wanted to try there, but I hadn't got a chance. And that is Morimoto's. If you like sushi, Chef Morimoto, he used to be on Iron Chef, which was a show that I watched a lot growing up with all the like dubbing.
I watched Iron Chef.
Yeah, so they would like pull like big fish and octopi and stuff out of a tank and say, cook it like right now. And I'm a sushi person. Morimoto has a sushi restaurant in Center City in Philadelphia, but I had never been there. I lived, there for 7 years. I'd never been there. When I was living there, it was notoriously difficult to get a reservation. So I looked at the map and realized that it was like half a mile walk from the conference hotel, and they opened at 5. And I was like, I bet I can get in at 5 and get a seat at the bar and like get some really good sushi before they got too busy because it was Friday. So I walked over there, and lo and behold, I literally had to wait for them to unlock the door. It was like 4:58.
Good.
And so there was nobody in there. I got to sit at the bar, and it was the best sushi I've ever had. And in fact, I made the mistake a few days ago of getting sushi here in Texas because I have been craving it ever since I had Morimoto's, and it was not the same. So if you like sushi, they also do more traditional Japanese cooking like tonkatsus and things like that, teriyakis. If you like Japanese food at all, you have to go to Morimoto. It's amazing. The ambiance is beautiful. Try to get there when they open at 5 and you will have no problems. If you try to go later than that, I can't help you because it will get busy. But it was delicious, melts in your mouth sushi. I loved it.
That sounds awesome. All right. Well, Dr. Jasmine Harris, thank you so much for joining us on the Annex